I moved into the Hargrove building on a Thursday in November, which I mention only because Thursdays are when the garbage trucks come. And the smell that first greeted me at the entrance was something I mistook. In those early days, 4 rotting food left too long at the curb. I was 31, recently divorced, carrying 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen things my ex-wife hadn't wanted. The super, a thick-necked man named Delroy, showed me the apartment with the efficiency of someone who had done it 400 times and expected to do it 400 more. He told me the heat came on at 6, the elevator broke every few weeks, and the woman in 4A was deaf, so I shouldn't bother knocking if I needed to reach her. He said nothing about 4B. I didn't ask. The apartment was a rectangle with 2 windows that faced a brick wall, and I told myself it was temporary. The way you tell yourself everything is temporary when you're trying not to think too carefully about your life. I unpacked my suitcases that night, ate a sandwich standing over the kitchen sink, and went to sleep listening to the city's low, indifferent noise. That was the first night I heard the counting. It came through the wall that separated my bedroom from the unit next door, which I understood from the building's layout to be for B. It was a man's voice, quiet but distinct, counting in a rhythm that had no particular urgency. The way a person counts when they are doing something methodical. 1, 2, 3. I lay still and listened. He reached 47 and stopped. I assumed it was nothing. A man counting inventory or following some exercise routine or talking himself through medication. I turned over and slept. The second night the counting started at 2 a.m. and reached 112 before going silent. The third night I pressed my ear to the wall and understood that the voice was not moving. It was coming from the same fixed point each time, a spot near the baseboard, perhaps 4 feet from the floor. I knocked once on the wall and the counting stopped immediately, as if cut with a blade. The silence that followed had a texture to it that I cannot describe, except to say it felt attended, like the silence of someone holding their breath rather than the silence of an empty room. I asked Delroy the next morning who lived in 4B. He looked at me for a moment before answering. He said a man named Carell had been there 6 years, kept to himself, no trouble. I asked if Carell worked nights. Delroy said he didn't know. I asked what Carell looked like. Delroy said average, just average, and moved away from me in a way that closed the conversation. I started keeping a notebook. Not because I was frightened, not yet, but because I am a person who distrusts his own memory, and I wanted a record. October 31st. Counting began at 1:14 a.m., ended at 1:58 a.m. Highest number reached was 203. November 2nd. Counting began at 3:30 a.m. 3 distinct sessions with pauses of roughly 8 minutes between them. I noted that the pauses were always the same length, 8 minutes. I timed them for separate nights, and the variance was never more than 30 seconds. Whatever Carell was doing, he was doing it with precision. I saw him for the first time on a Sunday morning in the elevator. He was a small man, perhaps 55, with colorless hair combed flat against his head and eyes that were pale and closely set. He was wearing a gray cardigan and holding a paper bag from the pharmacy on the corner. He nodded at me. I said good morning and asked if he was Carell. He said yes. I told him I was his new neighbor, that I'd moved in 2 weeks ago. He said he knew. The elevator reached the lobby, and he walked out before the doors had fully opened, without looking back. His shoes, I noticed, made no sound on the tile. That evening, I stood in the hallway outside for B and listened at the door for 10 minutes. I heard nothing. I told myself I was behaving irrationally. I was recently divorced and sleeping badly, and I had attached significance to the sounds of a middle-aged man doing something harmless in his own apartment at night. I went back inside and poured a glass of whiskey and sat with it until I felt reasonable again. The notebook entry for that night reads, nothing. Stopped listening. Then, below that, in handwriting that is slightly different from the lines above, as if written at a different hour. He was outside my door at 4 a.m. I heard his breathing. I don't know how long he stood there. I had written that and had no memory of writing it. I stared at it for a long time. The handwriting was mine. I was not sleepwalking. I had never sleepwalked, and the pen I had used was on the desk where I kept it. The entry was dated, and the date was correct. I read it 6 times, and each time it said the same thing. He was outside my door at 4 a.m. I heard his breathing. I don't know how long he stood there. I checked my door lock. It was engaged. I checked the window latches. I sat in the kitchen with the lights on until morning. I did not hear the counting that night. When I saw Delroy 2 days later, I told him I wanted to know more about Carell. Delroy's face did something that I would call evasion if I were being charitable. He said Carell was a quiet tenant, and he hoped there was no trouble between us. I said there was no trouble. I was only curious. Delroy said he had work to do. I said, directly, "Is there anything I should know about the man in 4B?" Delroy put down what he was holding and looked at me with an expression that I've replayed many times since. It was not fear exactly. It was the expression of a man choosing the exact boundary of what he will and will not say. He said Carell had a brother. The brother lived in that apartment before Carell moved in. The brother died there. He said it quickly and then picked up what he'd been holding and left. I went upstairs and stood in my apartment and thought about that. The brother died there. People die in apartments. It is a city. People die everywhere. I thought about the counting and the 8-minute pauses and the entry I had written and could not remember writing. I thought about Carell's pale eyes and his silent shoes and the way he had said he knew. When I told him I was his new neighbor. As if my arrival were something he had been informed of rather than something he had simply noticed. That night, I didn't sleep. At 2 a.m., I heard the counting begin. I opened my notebook and I wrote down the numbers as he said them. 1 through 100, then the 8-minute silence. Then 101 through 200, then silence again. During the third silence, I became aware that the counting had shifted. It was no longer coming from the wall near the baseboard. It was coming from directly above the baseboard. It was coming from the closet that shared the wall between our apartments. I sat very still. The counting resumed on the other side of the closet door, which was closed. I have not opened that closet since. I have not seen Carell in the hallway. I asked Delroy last week whether Carell had been around, and Delroy said he hadn't seen him in some time. When I asked how long, Delroy said he couldn't say exactly. A few weeks maybe, and then he asked me why I wanted to know. I told him I thought I heard someone in his apartment at night. Delroy's face did the same thing it had done before. He said he would look into it. He has not looked into it. I am writing this at my kitchen table at 3 a.m. with every light in the apartment on. The counting started 40 minutes ago. It is at 178. The closet door is closed. I have pushed a chair under the handle. From behind the door, through the wood and the dark, the voice continues. 179. 180. Patient, precise, going nowhere. I found the journal in the wall of my new apartment. Sealed behind a loose brick near the bathroom floor, wrapped in a plastic bag that had gone yellow and brittle with age. I should have thrown it away. I know that now. Instead, I sat on the cold tile and read every word by the light of my phone, while the tap dripped and the building settled around me in the dark. The journal belonged to a man named Carl Dreyer, and the first entry was dated September 3, 2009. He wrote in a small, disciplined hand, the kind you associate with engineers or accountants, men who believe in precision. His opening line was, "I have started to hear it again." There was no explanation of what it was, no preamble, no context. Just that sentence, written as though continuing a conversation already in progress. I went back to bed and told myself it was nothing. The next morning, I placed the journal on the kitchen counter and made coffee and stared at it while the machine gurgled. I told myself that people leave things in walls all the time, that it meant nothing. I opened it again on my lunch break. Carl's second entry described a sound coming from the apartment directly above his. A dragging sound. Slow, rhythmic, like something heavy being pulled in a circle. He wrote that it happened only between 2 and 4 in the morning, and that it had been going on for 11 days. He had knocked on the door of the upstairs unit. No one answered. The building manager told him the apartment had been vacant for 3 months. I live on the top floor. There is no apartment above me. I told myself that explained nothing, that the building had been remodeled, that floors and units get reconfigured. I kept reading. By the 6th entry, Carl's writing had changed. The letters were still precise, but the pressure was heavier, the pen gouging slightly into the paper. He wrote that the dragging had begun to move, that it no longer circled, that it moved instead toward the corner of the room directly above his bed, and stopped there and stayed there, every night for exactly the length of time it took him to fall asleep. He knew this because he had started keeping a clock on the nightstand and noting the time when the sound ceased. It always ceased the moment he crossed into sleep. He did not explain how he knew the exact moment he crossed into sleep. I closed the journal. That night I lay in bed and listened to my apartment and heard nothing except the refrigerator and distant traffic, and once, around midnight, what sounded like a dog somewhere below on the street. I slept fine. I told myself the story was the product of an anxious mind, that Carl Dreyer had been unwell, that the journal was the artifact of a private breakdown and nothing more. I did not open it again for 4 days. On the 5th day, I woke at 2:17 in the morning to a sound I could not immediately identify. It was coming from the corner of my bedroom, not from above. From the corner itself, from the junction of the 2 walls and the ceiling, a sound like slow pressure applied to old wood, not a creak exactly. More deliberate than a creak, more patient. I turned on the lamp. The sound stopped. I sat up and looked at the corner, and there was nothing there. I left the lamp on and did not sleep again until 6 in the morning, when the light outside had changed and the city had started its noise, and the corner was just a corner. I opened the journal that afternoon with my hands flat on the table to keep them steady. Carl's later entries described a progression. The sound had moved from above him to beside him, then to the floor of his room. He wrote that he had begun to sense, without evidence, a quality of attention in the room at night. The way you sense someone watching you before you see them, a prickle at the base of the skull, a certainty that the air in the room has been altered by a presence. He wrote this without drama, in the same accountant's hand, as though documenting a faulty appliance. He wrote that he had stopped inviting people over because the feeling did not occur when others were present, only when he was alone, only in the dark, only after 2. The last entry in the journal was dated November 19, 2009. It was 3 words. It found me. There were no more entries. I searched Carl Dreyer online that evening and found a brief notice in a local archive. He had been found unresponsive in his apartment in November 2009. The cause was listed as cardiac arrest. He was 34 years old. The apartment was listed at the address of my building. I sat with that for a long time. I am a rational person. I work in logistics. I believe in causes and effects and documentation, and I do not believe in hauntings or presences or things that move in corners. I told myself that Carl had been ill, that his heart had failed him, that the journal was the record of a deteriorating mind and nothing else. I put the journal in a drawer and made dinner and watched television until midnight and went to bed. I woke at 2:09. The corner of my room was making a sound. Not wood settling, not the building contracting in the cold. Something slower. Something with interval and intention. I did not turn on the lamp this time. I do not know why I did not turn on the lamp. I lay still, and I listened, and I felt. With a certainty I cannot account for and cannot dismiss. That whatever was in the corner was aware of me in the same way I was aware of it. That we were attending to each other in the dark. The sound stopped at 3:51. I know, because I watched the clock the whole time. The way Carl had watched his clock. And I understood then that he had not written the journal as a warning. He had written it because he needed someone to know. The next morning, I packed a bag. I am writing this from a hotel 2 miles away. I have not gone back. I am aware that what I am describing sounds like the record of a man coming apart at the edges. And I am aware that a rational explanation exists for every element of this account. I am also aware that Carl Dreyer was 34 years old and that I am 33. And that whatever he encountered in that apartment in November of 2009 left no mark on his body that the medical examiner could name. I keep the journal with me. I read it again last night in the hotel room with every light on. I read it slowly, the way you read something you are trying to memorize. When I finished, I set it on the nightstand and turned off the lamp because I am not a man who sleeps with the lights on. At 2:14, I heard something in the corner of the hotel room. Slow, patient, present. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. And I remembered the exact time because I had been lying awake watching the ceiling fan turn slow circles in the dark, counting the rotations the way some people count sheep. Not out of insomnia exactly, but out of that peculiar wakefulness that arrives when the body knows something the mind hasn't admitted yet. My phone lit up on the nightstand. No caller ID. I answered it because I always answer. A habit from years of working night shifts at the hospital where I trained. Where you learned early that silence was a luxury and an unanswered call was a failure you'd carry. There was breathing on the line. Not heavy or theatrical. Not the kind you hear in bad films. Just ordinary breathing. The kind that belongs to a person sitting in a room doing nothing in particular. I said hello twice. The breathing continued. I said hello a third time and the call disconnected. I set the phone down and lay there in the dark for a long time before I understood that my hands were shaking. Not because of the call itself. Because I recognized the breathing. My brother David had been dead for 11 months. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. And I am not a man given to mysticism or sentiment or the kind of grief that bends reality into shapes that comfort the bereaved. I am a physician. I have watched people die in clean rooms and dirty ones, in hallways, in cars, in the open air. I understand what death is in the biological sense, the cessation of electrical activity, the cooling of the body, the absolute and irreversible finality of it. I had identified David's body myself because our parents were gone and he had no one else. I had stood in a room that smelled of antiseptic and cold metal and looked at my brother's face and said, yes, that is him, and I had signed the paperwork with a hand that did not shake. The breathing on the phone had been his. I cannot explain to you how I knew. I simply knew the way you know the smell of your childhood home or the particular weight of a specific silence. Some knowledge lives below the threshold of language and refuses to be argued out of existence. I did not sleep again that night. The second call came 3 weeks later, same hour, same absence of caller ID, same breathing. This time, I did not speak. I held the phone to my ear and listened, and after perhaps 90 seconds, the line went dead. I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my lap, and I thought about David very carefully and methodically, the way I approach a difficult diagnosis, trying to separate what I knew from what I was constructing. David had died of a cardiac event at 34. He had been alone in his apartment. The neighbor had found him 2 days later. There had been nothing unusual about the circumstances. No trauma, no mystery. The medical examiner had been thorough, and I had read the report 3 times. He was gone. I knew he was gone. I drove to his apartment the next morning. I still had the key because his landlord had given me 90 days to clear his belongings, and I had been doing it slowly. The way you peel a wound, a few hours at a time. The apartment was exactly as I had left it 2 weeks before. His books on the shelves in the order he kept them. Spines aligned with a precision that had always struck me as slightly desperate. As if he believed that if everything was ordered correctly, the world would hold its shape. His coffee mug still on the counter because I could not bring myself to move it. His laptop closed on the desk. I sat in his chair by the window, and I looked out at the street below, where a woman was walking a dog through pale morning light, and I tried to feel something definitive, and could not. The third call came on a Tuesday, and this time there was something beyond the breathing. It was faint, and I had to press the phone hard against my ear, and I am aware that what I am about to describe is not something I can prove. That it exists entirely within the testimony of one sleep-deprived man sitting alone in the dark. But I heard him say my name. Daniel, the way he had always said it, flat on both syllables, no rise at the end. The inflection of someone who knew you so well, they had stopped performing familiarity. I said his name back. The call ended. I sat with the phone until the screen went dark, and then I sat in the darkness for a long time. I called his number the next morning, the number I had never deleted, and listened to his voicemail greeting, his voice telling me he wasn't available to leave a message. And I thought about how the dead leave these small electronic ghosts behind. Voices preserved in servers somewhere, whole personalities archived in photographs and message threads. And how grief is partly the work of learning to distinguish between the echo and the source. But I had not called myself. I had not manufactured those calls. I am certain of that. I am certain in the way that I am certain of very little else from that period. I began to sleep with the phone face down. I began to take long drives after midnight. Because the movement helped, and because in a moving car the walls could not come close. I stopped going to the apartment. I told myself I was doing better. I told my colleague Renata, who had been watching me with the careful attention of someone waiting for a structure to fail, that I was doing better, and she nodded in a way that meant she didn't believe me, but was willing to wait. The fourth call came in February. It was different. The breathing was gone. There was only silence. A specific quality of silence that I cannot describe except to say that it was occupied, that it had a texture, that something was present in it, the way a person is present in a room before you see them. I held the phone for a long time. I did not speak. Eventually I said, "I know you're there." The silence continued. Then, just before the call ended, a sound. Not a word. Not breathing. A sound like someone setting something down on a hard surface, the small final sound of an object being placed with care, the sound of a person who is finished with something and leaving it behind. I have not received another call. That was 8 months ago. I finished clearing the apartment in March. I washed the coffee mug. I donated the books. I kept one photograph, the two of us at a lake when we were children, squinting into the sun. I put it in a drawer because I am not ready to look at it every day, but I am not willing to let it go. I still answer calls with no caller ID. I always will. Not because I believe in ghosts in any meaningful sense. Not because I have abandoned the framework of the rational world that has held me together through every difficult thing. But because I know what I heard. And if it was him, I want him to know I was there.